starting in the 4th minute with Zinsberger facilitating Arsenal centre-backs splitting in what was a 2-4 shape versus Chelsea's mid-block 4-4-2. Zinsberger, playing as almost this central centre-back, was mirrored by Hannah Hampton, the Chelsea goalkeeper, during Chelsea's deep build-up. Of course, this allows those wide centre-backs to be able to push up into the wide spaces. It allows the fullbacks, such as McCabe here, to be able to push much higher around the 4-4-2 mid-block, allowing Arsenal to avoid the two centre-forwards centrally and potentially get the ball into the Arsenal forwards beyond the Chelsea midfield line. Typically, Arsenal would just pass into that channel and they would look to try and create near side. But of course, when they did commit to a side, Chelsea would try and press towards that side, mark those short options, and so there was an opportunity for a switch out towards the other side. But when that did occur, it typically took quite the long route through the centre-backs, and so quick switches of play didn't happen often. Notice how the Chelsea fullback, Liam Charles, rushes out to try and confront the Arsenal fullback McCabe, supported by the near side wide midfielder Wrighton. This was a pattern for Chelsea where they gambled with the rest of their defenders essentially going 1v1 at the back, and the rest of the midfield trying to somewhat mark those short passing options, such that if Chelsea could win back possession, they would be in a prime position for the likes of James just off screen to be able to start a counter-attack, which is exactly what we see here, with Chelsea initially going back as a means to then go forwards and start that counter-attack with James and Wrighton leading it. Note that Nusken typically stayed more centrally. She was more of a fixture, almost at centre forward, to allow James to be able to roam and take up those more unorthodox positions. That attack breaks down and we get a little bit of deja vu again with that split centre-back setup, although Eidevall is positioned such that she can move between that left centre-back position or CDM role, rather than recreating that 3-1 synchronised movement that we showed Arsenal had up their sleeve in the Arsenal vs Tottenham match that we recently analysed. We see Leah Williamson mix things up with a nice little chipped ball beyond the midfield line of Chelsea's 4-4-2 mid-block, taking advantage of how the Chelsea fullback is going to try and press the Arsenal fullback to instead play into Beth Mead between the lines. Unfortunately, as per usual for Arsenal this game, they weren't able to use these opportunities to force Chelsea's defenders into choosing whether to retreat or confront them by attacking centrally or passing centrally. Instead, we see here one of the many unforced errors which leads to this Chelsea throw-in. Both teams use synchronised movements, but I thought this was quite a nice little one. We see a little pattern here by Cuthbert and Leopolds moving in such a way as to test where Little's priorities lie and free up a passing option for the Chelsea throw-in taker. Moving on through that phase of play, we see one of Arsenal's many enforced errors, and a key reason I included this phase of play because, in my humble opinion, it eroded Arsenal's sense of security and confidence as run-of-the-mill passes are going astray, creating momentum in Chelsea's favour. Of course, then forcing Arsenal to scramble to reset as Chelsea threaten a counter-attack. Chelsea choose to retreat to their defence and their goalkeeper. Fortunately for us, that lets us see what I was talking about with Hannah Hampton becoming that quasi-central centre-back, similar to what we saw with Zinsberger facilitating the splitting here of the Chelsea centre-backs. This being with Chelsea playing in more of this 2-3 shape with Leopolds as our CDM and Cuthbert pushing higher, although she could also drop into a CDM role with Leopolds pushing higher, but typically she wanted to stay in a more advanced creative role. Lauren James often sought to drop to link the play and just as often was tracked, as we see here with Wubben-Moy, but she was rarely stopped. Unfortunately, with Wubben-Moy stepping out from defence, it forces the remaining defenders to narrow, which then creates space in the wide areas for Chelsea to try and exploit. Unfortunately, with Lauren James on the ball, she will be able to ride whatever pressure she has, get her head up and force these transitions by getting the ball out into those wide spaces for the wide midfielders or the fullbacks to exploit. And so we see exactly that. I'd say imagine Arsenal had a fullback four here, allowing them instead to cover a wider amount of the pitch, reducing both the space in the wide areas, but then also making it a lot more difficult to be able to play a through ball into one of these central areas for these runners in central spaces. Of course, this is all wishful thinking because it would require the likes of Eidevall and Pelova to be able to stop the somewhat unstoppable. And of course, then we get to see the knock-on effects of all of this, with Perisset able to get into a great crossing position, Catley forced to go out to try and confront her, hopefully reducing the accuracy of the cross, but then creating essentially 2 versus 3 in Chelsea's favour in Arsenal's box. Fortunately, on this occasion, the gamble pays off, but I definitely think that stepping out to confront James did a lot more harm than good this game. I'm going to pass on discussing Chelsea's midfield shape real detail, because I think more of their attack came from transitions really rather than sustained midfield possession. Touching here in the 26th minute on Chelsea's deep build-up with a short goal kick, setting up in this 2-3 shape, versus Arsenal in a 4-1-3-2 with Little pushing into a more advanced role and Walty covering. Playing these short passes initially allowed Chelsea to draw Arsenal into pressing. Of course, that also keeps them relatively spread out, allowing Chelsea's goalkeeper Hannah Hampton to then be able to try and take advantage of that space by playing it long into those wide spaces, typically where Cuthbert was positioned so that they could contest both aerial duels and second balls. And so we see some of that here with the 2-3 and Arsenal's 4-1-3-2, although McCabe has stepped out to try and contest here against Cuthbert. Lauren James, unlike the Arsenal forwards Rousseau, Blackstenius, was highly effective. Despite not being great in her aerial duels, Lauren James managed to link well with her teammate, dribble through any amount of pressure, provided the occasional counter-attacking threat, and of course she dropped often to link play as a false 9. Unfortunately, Arsenal's wide midfielders, such as Ford and Beth Mead, didn't have quite the same influence with either their positioning, their combos, or dribbling. Continuing the theme of attacking impotency, Arsenal's planned substitutions, such as Rousseau coming on, became a lot less effective, in my opinion, due to the game state of Chelsea sitting comfortably at 3-0. Of course, Rousseau adds guile, she adds control to the attack, but by this point, Arsenal lacked any confidence to capitalise on her clever movement and touches, because Anne Blackstenius earlier in the game wasn't utilised because Arsenal were in possession, and so she didn't have the channels to be able to run into and use her pace. Getting back to this phase of play, we eventually see McCabe take a shot, which in my opinion is an unforced error given just how far away she is from goal, although don't tell McCabe I think that. So I mentioned how Chelsea set up with that 2-3 shape from their goal kicks. I also think it's important to mention how they managed the game at this point. It's 3-0. They were happy for Hannah Hampton to kick it long to Lauren James as the focal point, because there really was no need for them to introduce any danger with short goal kicks, which could gift opportunities for turnovers in Chelsea's defensive third to Arsenal. Typically, these long goal kicks had Lauren James as the focal point, but fortunately, this is her weakness, and so it did blunt Chelsea's attack. I say that, he still was a menace. Moving on to the 58th minute, sounding like a broken record, talking about Arsenal substitutions, but with the midfield change, bringing on Marnham, it did give them an alternative to their throw-ins of just throwing it long into Rousseau or Blackstenius earlier. Now they could mix it up with Marnham, who was just as adept, and also added a bit more steel to their midfield by having Little drop deeper, who's a lot more likely to put in a foot when Chelsea counter-attack relative to Pelova. Rousseau dropping off like this is just textbook Rousseau. Silky feet, good touch, good vision to spread the play. Unfortunately, it's too late. It's 3-0, and so this ability, somewhat wasted, would have been super useful in the first half, where instead, when they played those balls over Chelsea's 4-4-2 midfield shape, one would hope, although she didn't do it on this occasion, given she'd been immediately closed down by Buchanan, she might have looked to try and get into that central space, driving Arsenal forward. Although we do see Arsenal try and advance here. I think in the first half they did use a 3-1 shape with Walty dropping to left centre-back, Pelova technically at CDM, and then on occasion they could have Pelova join Little in the space between the lines, such that they were both number 8. But I think in the second half there was more onus to attack, especially basically they committed more players forward, as you can somewhat see that here as Beth Mead again trying her luck with some dribbling, but nothing really was coming off for them. We've got our forwards for Arsenal all attacking the box. We've got all our midfield in shot. Our near-sided fullback high up the pitch. Of course, then we have our centre-backs and near-sided fullback deeper for cover. But essentially, Arsenal were trying to push more players up. You'd end up with the centre-back near side, so Ruben Moy on this occasion, also trying to push up to cover for the fact that the fullback was pushing so high. So you'd end up with just 2 players deeper, and Arsenal just as a unit in a more advanced position. Given the potential for Chelsea to counter-attack, Ruben Moy is still doing that counter-pressing role here, flying out, stopping the counter-attack at source, and allowing Arsenal to reset back into that 3-1 shape, except with Marnham at CDM now. And Arsenal try and progress this attack and demonstrate what I was trying to get at there with committing numbers forward. We have our forward line, we've got our far-sided fullback essentially at left wing, and we have all of our 3 midfielders in advanced positions higher up the pitch. So you can see that Arsenal were definitely really trying to push the point. Delving into a few of the stats just to confirm Chelsea's domination, despite the fact that they had less possession, they didn't really seem to want or need it to dominate the game anyway. We even see that in the fact that they got into Arsenal's penalty area less often than they get into opponents' penalty areas, but it didn't matter. They were just as devastating. Of course, you could argue Nusken's deflections were both clever and lucky. Looking at Arsenal, of course, the flip side, they had a lot of possession, but it was very impotent. Most, i.e. 77% of their possession were in low threat areas, so we're thinking of their defensive third and the middle third, and then they only had 23% in Chelsea's defensive third versus the typical 33% that they have against the average WSL opposition. To hammer on this impotency point, let's look at pass completion. So starting with Arsenal as a whole, their pass completion this game was actually higher than their average in a WSL match this season, and yet they still did so poorly. Can you see the pattern? I'll give you a second. Now, can you see the pattern? These are Arsenal's midfielders and attackers, and most had a 3 to 5% drop in their pass completion percentage relative to their season average, except Russo. Ignore Russo. And then it gets really obvious if you look at the starting 11 and explains Eidevall's substitutions. Of course, this issue coupled with Arsenal typically having a low tackle success rate and their rest defence being quite fragile here. I'm thinking of the distance between Eidevall and Ruben Moy, or Catley and Ruben Moy, just made this quite an easy win for Chelsea. I could go further and talk about their missed controls per 90 also being up, but I think you get the point. And with that, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, consider sharing it on social media, subscribing, leaving a comment down below, and with that, we're out.